I can't see myself anymore.
What's up, everybody? It's Jordan, and welcome to the Sports Student Hines Show. Today is November 23rd, 2021. Today is Tuesday, so the college football playoff rankings were released a couple of hours ago. We have a lot to get into on today's episode. This past week, there were so many upsets in college football and the NFL, so many just games you not really expect the outcome, like the Ohio State, annihilating Michigan State, Oregon getting humiliated against Utah. In the NFL, there were some games. The Houston Texans beat the Tennessee Titans, which is definitely the upset of the year. We normally talk about the NFL on this show and football in general, but today's episode is going to kind of lean more towards college football. And in today's episode, I am joined the host of the Section 111 podcast, TJ Shoemaker. How you doing today, TJ?
Hey, Jordan, it's good to be on. I appreciate you having me on, and I'm excited to talk some college football and maybe talk a little bit about the Gators and their current situation too.
You have a lot to get into. I've been very vocal of Dan Mullen needs to be fired the past few weeks on Instagram, and it happened on Sunday. Despite me wanting it to happen, it was honestly still kind of surprising to me that it actually did. We'll kind of talk about that, later in the show because we're going to be talking about that probably for a long time. So, like I mentioned, the college football playoff rankings were released a couple of hours ago. It's a major shakeup in the top six with Michigan State and Oregon losing, like I mentioned. So, number 6 is Notre Dame. Number 5 is Michigan. 4 is Cincinnati. 3 is Alabama. 2 Ohio State. And 1 is Georgia. This is the first time ever a group of 5 has been listed ever in the top 4 for the college football playoff rankings. So, TJ, what are your kind of thoughts on these rankings for the top 6?
Well, I think that they pretty much hit it spot on. I don't have any complaints with the top 6 at all. Obviously the big mover this week was Ohio State jumping up from number 4 to number 2, which I don't think that anyone really has an issue with the way that they handled Michigan State this past weekend. That's the one game that kind of really surprised me. I felt like Ohio State would probably go in that game and handle Michigan State, but I didn't realize that it was going to be as bad as it was. So, for them to go up 42-0 before Michigan State really knew what hit them, that was a big surprise. And I think that Ohio State really earned that number 2 ranking this week. I think that it could potentially set them up in the future to challenge Georgia for the number 1 spot. Really assuming Alabama knocks them off next week in the SEC championship. I think that that's a possibility, although, at the moment I would kind of favor Georgia in that game. But, Ohio State has set themselves up nicely. And, we've got a big matchup this weekend with Ohio State playing at Michigan, which, side note, my brother's actually going to be at the game. So that's pretty cool. So he'll be able to kind of tell me some cool stories about the weekend and let us know about the atmosphere up in Ann Arbor.
That's really, really cool. That's one of those games like you have at the top of your bucket list. I'm an Ohio State fan, but that'd still be an amazing game to see. Obviously, the stakes are super high right now. Whoever wins the East. Most of these teams are in the top 6 right now. And to me, it's like Ohio State humiliated Michigan State. And, Oregon, they were in the top 6 as well. They got humiliated by Utah. Said the whole time, Oregon and Michigan State were the 2 most overrated teams in the country. I'm so glad that stupid BS excuse that Oregon had head-to-head over Ohio State. I'm glad that excuse is now over with. Because like I said, I do not like Ohio State at all. But the disrespect they've had really up until this point is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
And they humiliate Michigan State, who some people actually thought they were comparable to Ohio State, which is laughable. Then you have Oregon, who got blown out by Utah. Utah has been on a winning streak as of late. Oregon, we're talking about a team who Oregon, they beat Ohio State at the beginning of the year, but at that time, Ohio State arguably had the youngest team in college football. And the fact that they're this young and are without a doubt the second best team in the country really proves how good they're going to be in the next couple of years. And with that Oregon game, to me, it's like I don't think there was ever a moment a week after Oregon beat Ohio State. In my opinion, there was never a moment where Oregon was better than Ohio State because, I mean, you look at it, Oregon lost to a 3-8 Stanford team, but people still thought Oregon should have been over Ohio State. That logic, is this 3-8 Stanford going to be ahead of Oregon and Ohio State? Like the head-to-head excuse to me, I'm very glad that it's over with. Ohio State, to me, I mean, they are just phenomenal right now. I've had, my top 4 college football playoff rankings. My top 4 and the teams have not changed since the first rankings on November 2nd. 5 and 6 to me are debatable. Michigan, I think, is number 5. 6, I mean, I don't disagree having Notre Dame. I actually have Oklahoma State. I really feel like 6 is a toss-up with a couple of different teams. I even kind of thought about having Baylor at number 6 as well. It's just, you look at some of these teams like Notre Dame, they're good. I think they're overrated a little bit. They almost lost to Toledo. They almost lost to Florida State, who's going to be battling Florida this week just to get bowl eligible. Look at Oklahoma State. They only beat Tulsa by 5, but at the same time, Cincinnati only beat Tulsa by 8. So it's interesting. Oklahoma State do have one loss against Iowa State. Michigan, I really feel like they're number 5. Alabama, I know it's kind of crazy having them number 4. I feel like Alabama is probably the 4th team in the country right now. I'm not saying Cincinnati would beat Alabama, but I just feel like overall it's hard for me to put Alabama over Cincinnati, especially because Alabama, despite only having one loss, they have not played as what they should be. They beat LSU by only 6 points. They beat Arkansas this past week by only 7 points.
Right.
Cincinnati is undefeated. I don't know what more you can possibly want from them. I know up until this SMU game this past week, they did not cover the spread the last 5 games, but they're still undefeated, and they beat the number 6 team in the country on the road. That was their first, home loss in over 20 games. And obviously number 2 is Ohio State, 1 is Georgia. I really feel like I've been saying it for months. I feel like Georgia, a little bit of a gap. Ohio State, significant gap. And then there's everybody else. Like this is there's 2 teams. I don't think anybody else is possibly close with those 2 teams.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the good thing about all this, and I keep telling myself this, is that it's all going to play itself out because Alabama and Georgia have to play each other. So, in that scenario, or there's really 2 scenarios that could happen here. I mean, Alabama could beat Georgia, and all of a sudden you've got 1-loss Alabama, who's an SEC champion, and 1-loss Georgia, non-SEC champion. But no matter what, I think Georgia has pretty much solidified themselves as a playoff team, even if they lose to Alabama. I think that's pretty much a given. So you could potentially have 2 SEC teams, and then you've got presumably Ohio State or Michigan, depending on what happens this week, that could really, come out of the Big Ten and as the Big Ten champion. And then it kind of comes down to that 4th spot. And at that point, you would have undefeated Cincinnati. You could have 1-loss Oklahoma State, or even 1-loss Oklahoma, winning the Big 12. There's a lot of implications this weekend with that Oklahoma State game. And if Oklahoma beats Oklahoma State, they're actually going to rematch in the Big 10 championship, or Big 12 championship. So, it's still really wide open. There's still really 7 teams, fighting for 4 spots at the moment. So I'm really anxious to see how it plays out. But if I were to give a prediction, I would say that I think Georgia's going to beat Alabama, and I think that's kind of going to knock Alabama out of contention. I just don't see how, with the other teams in play, I don't see a 2-loss Alabama getting in. So I'm going to say Georgia, Ohio State, Cincinnati, and possibly Notre Dame. Cincinnati was Notre Dame's only loss this year, so there's a chance that if Oklahoma and Oklahoma State kind of beat up on each other, there's a chance that Cincinnati could sneak in there, or Notre Dame could sneak in there behind Cincinnati. And but I kind of think that Oklahoma is gonna come out of nowhere and kind of shock some people and beat Oklahoma State not only once but twice, and end up playing in the college football playoff, which, this was kind of not my best take I've ever had, but at the beginning of the season, I actually picked Oklahoma to win the whole thing. I don't feel that way anymore, but I think that they still do have a shot, to get in the college football playoff this year.
It's interesting because, up until, the first initial rankings of the college football playoffs, Oklahoma, they were in the top 10. I believe they were 8, and then they had to bye, and then that's when they lost. Oklahoma, to me, and it's so interesting because you can honestly make the case for even teams like Oklahoma State and Notre Dame, all these teams who, despite having one loss, they are still in it because you look at Georgia and Ohio State, those are pretty much 2 locks as long as Ohio State wins this week.
Right.
And we haven't really seen 3 and 4 be so wide open in years. Honestly, you can make a case that's the most wide open 2 spots have been ever in the college football playoffs. But Oklahoma State, I mean, even Michigan State, Oregon, all of those teams to me are just very inconsistent. I said months ago, I feel like Oklahoma is 2014 Florida State. And if you go back at Florida State, they had Jameis Winston. That was the year after they won the championship. They were, they weren't playing good, but they were undefeated. They were barely getting each game. And then, they ended up winning the ACC championship game. They were undefeated heading into the playoffs, and they played Oregon, and they lost by 30 points. And it was, you knew it was going to happen because Florida State sucked against every single team who wasn't even great, just good against. And I feel like that's kind of, in my opinion, this kind of a similar situation with Oklahoma this year. I mean, I believe it was Tulane earlier in the year they barely beat. They struggled against Kansas. They struggled against a couple of teams. This Oklahoma State team, they're a little bit underrated, but I've talked about, earlier about some of these teams having close games like Notre Dame. Oklahoma State's had some close games too. This could go either way, but I feel like Oklahoma State, I'm going to kind of give the edge to them because they've been more consistent. Mm-hmm. But if those 2 teams split, I mean, if you're the Big 12, you're clearly ticked off because if they split, clearly they're both out. And then that's a wide open spot for possibly maybe Notre Dame, who doesn't play, great competition like Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, Georgia. All these teams are going to be playing top competition while Notre Dame plays 3 and 8 Stanford. So it's interesting because it's like Notre Dame, to me, doesn't necessarily deserve a top 4 ranking. But with all these teams playing each other, it kind of just, falls in place for the Fighting Irish if all these teams kind of, split the games and everything.
Yeah, I mean, that very well could happen. I mean, I think that Notre Dame very well could end up sliding right in there and in that 4th spot. And one team to mention that I think we're kind of forgetting a little bit about is Baylor. I know that they have 2 losses, but they can also still win the Big 12. They need Oklahoma State to beat Oklahoma, and if that happens, I believe that they're in the Big 12 championship against Oklahoma State. So you could have a 2-loss Baylor team come out of the Big 12 and play, have a chance to play in the college football playoff. I think they would obviously in the scenarios that we talked about, they would be compared with Notre Dame, a 1-loss non-conference champion, in Notre Dame. So, I mean, there's a chance that they could give a team like Baylor the edge over Notre Dame. And, I don't know how good that is for TV. So, I mean, I don't know what they're going to really weigh in those meetings and stuff. Obviously, they're going to look at the resumes and stuff like that. But in the back of their minds, they've got to be saying Notre Dame is a big brand. Like, they're gonna sell tickets. They're gonna be good TV to watch. So, there's always that possibility too that a team like Baylor or someone like that could end up kind of potentially getting screwed, or Oklahoma State, just based on who they are and their history as a program. So that's something to watch out for.
It's interesting because to me, I don't think there should ever be a 2-loss team get in the college football playoffs as long as this format is 4 teams in it. And then, we've kind of talked about, well, Alabama's going to play Georgia in SEC championship. You just mentioned a scenario where Baylor with 2 losses could still end up winning the Big 12. There's actually a scenario where, Alabama might not even be in the SEC championship game. If Alabama loses the week against Auburn, if A&M wins, as crazy as it sounds, A&M is going to represent the SEC West and the SEC championship. We've talked about this before the season, and then the final, it's obviously going to be Bama and Georgia in the SEC championship. And then the last week of the regular season, there's a chance that might not even happen. It's just crazy. There's so many dominoes that have to fall this week, and it's so interesting because you look at Michigan. I mean, if they lose, obviously they're out. Alabama loses, they're out. Oklahoma State, Oklahoma possibly plays each other twice. And if neither one of those teams, sweep each other, that team's not going to be in it. Obviously,
Yeah.
I don't think Baylor would be in it because they're 2-loss. It's interesting. This is one of the more intriguing college football, playoff rankings we've seen in a long time because the unknown is 3 and 4. And with so many interesting games this week, there's Ohio State and Michigan, there's Auburn and Alabama, there's Cincinnati against East Carolina, which I kind of figured that would be a blowout. But who are some of your kind of picks in some of these top games?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that it's gonna play itself out, and it's gonna be fun watching it play out. And this is one of those rare years where the 4-team playoff actually seems to be kind of perfect, with the way that it's playing out. Now I've kind of in the past been a supporter of playoff expansion for multiple reasons. Obviously, one, I want to see some of the best teams, say like in Alabama, if they don't end up making it, I would like to see them still have a chance. I know that kind of waters down the regular season, and I understand all those arguments, but I would like to see some of those games, especially if they would make it happen on college campuses. I think that expansion could be a good thing. And one big, not to get off on a tangent, but one big thing with me about college football playoff expansion, say to 8 teams or even 12, which I'm kind of a proponent of 8 teams as opposed to 12. But one thing that I like about it is when it comes to bowl season, expansion would really minimize teams having players sit out the bowl games. And obviously I'm a Florida fan, so I'm thinking about 2020 season when Florida plays Oklahoma in the Cotton Bowl, and it's not even the same Florida team because half the team sat out the bowl game. But I think about that, and if you think that if you put Florida in the college football playoff, say an 8-team playoff, all those guys with something still to play for, they play, and and Florida still has a chance. And I think last year Florida was a really good team, especially offensively. Had a historic offensive season. I think that they, might have been able to make a little bit of a run. So, there's multiple reasons, but really the players sitting out of the bowl games and just the overall health of the bowl games. I love watching college football bowl games. I grew up watching all those games. The Rose Bowl and all those big games that we have so many fond memories of. And all of a sudden, here they are starting to just kind of die off. And part of that is because players more and more are sitting out at the end of the season because they have nothing to play for. So I think that, we really have to be careful by either staying at 4 or even expanding to 12. I think that there is a fine line. And I really think that, maybe a number like 6 or 8 would possibly be pretty beneficial for the sport, to maintain the prominence of the bowl games and still give some of the top players in the country, like, Kyle Pitts and Kyle Trask and guys like that, something to play for. And, I think that in itself would bring better TV and, better entertainment for the fans. And, I think that's more importantly what it's all about.
Yeah, I've been somebody who's been, for expansion, but to me, I agree. I think it has to be 8. I feel like 12 is just overkill.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like this one year is kind of an exception that I feel like 4 is fine because like we talked about Ohio State and Georgia. And then, we're talking about teams in Notre Dame who might not even necessarily deserve a playoff spot, could possibly get in. So I feel like if you do it, you have to go 8. I completely agree what you said there about players, we saw Christian McCaffrey years ago with Stanford, him not playing his bowl game. That really ticked me off last year with Florida. We had Trevon Grimes, Tony, and Kyle Pitts, and I literally freaking had Kyle Pitts interview during the game. Like that ticked me off so much. It's like Kyle Trask demolished his draft stock in that game because he wanted to play, because, it's just interesting to me that Trask played that game, and you have those other guys who would rather sit out and worry about their draft stock than Trask, had nobody to throw to, sucked, was like a late round pick, second round pick, higher. And that game wasn't even close. Florida lost by like 20, 30 points, something like that. And when you have those players get out, you're going to lose money. You're going to not going to have as much viewership. It's not going to be as close of a game. But with those eight teams in the playoffs, let's say you have, I don't know, like your 7 teams would be the top seeds, and maybe some guarantees for each conference champion in the Power 5, or maybe each conference champion in that Big 12 and SEC, some Big 10, something like that. And you would have to have a group of 5, in my opinion. I feel like the group of 5, especially Cincinnati, I mean, this is the first time ever a group of 5 team has ever been ranked in the top 4. Group of 5s just get no respect. I mean, we are in the final, one of the final regular season weeks of college football. UTSA is undefeated and they're 22. Like, I'm not saying they should be up there with 5 and 6, with Michigan, but I am saying they should be a lot higher. I think they should be top 15. I know they haven't been great, and for an example, they beat Illinois. Illinois has beat Penn State. Illinois has also, I believe, they've beat Minnesota. At the time, those were 2 ranked teams. Illinois is better than people give them credit for because they're one of the lower half of the Big Ten. Nobody really cares about that win that UTSA had against them. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're undefeated. I mean, winning in college football is not easy. And even if you have an easy schedule, it's still very, very hard to go undefeated in the regular season. They have a chance to do that this week against North Texas. I mean, we saw years ago Marshall had a chance to go undefeated heading to the final week, and they blew it. It's like even when you have easy, schedules, it's still hard to do. We've seen, Memphis, compete against teams in the Power 5, in the Big Time Bowl, New Year's Six Bowl. We've seen Cincinnati compete. They lost by Georgia by 1 possession last year, and that's their only loss the last 20 games for Cincinnati. These group of 5 teams get no respect, despite having and pretty much forcing themselves to play big-time schools and big opponents to get recognition if they win. If they lose, oh, well, they suck because they lost against that team. But if they win, they're risking their whole schedule by having these big teams. It's, Cincinnati playing at Notre Dame 3-4 years ago. Everybody thought Notre Dame was going to win this game. Cincinnati, one of those teams may be trying to get a paycheck. You don't know how good they're going to be. I mean, they beat Notre Dame, who's number 6 right now, and it's possibly in contention for the playoffs. The lack of respect for group of 5 teams really ticks me off, especially, being a Marshall fan. But just like group of 5 teams get no respect. And I feel like if it's going to 8 teams to the college football playoffs, I feel like you have to have a group of 5. And it's much more interesting. It's tired of the Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama. Those 3 teams are pretty much a lock every single year. But when you have a team like Cincinnati and a team a couple years ago like UCF, it makes a much more interesting thing. You want to watch because, we haven't seen this, ever. So right. I feel like that could be a very good thing if it goes to 8. But if it goes to 8, I feel like there has to be a group of 5 involved.
Yeah, well, and to kind of, add to your point, and going back to my point a little bit, is I think that each team, regardless of, Power 5 or Group of 5, I think that everybody needs, something to play for, especially the worthy teams. So like a UTSA or someone like that. But I think that it would be a great thing for the Group of 5 if they even had their own sort of playoff, because I think back to the Marshall Bowl game last year where Brendan Knox and, a couple of the other big-time players that Marshall had sat out that game because, they were getting ready for the NFL just like everybody else. But, if you had a Group of 5 playoff, I'm not sure if last year Marshall would have been in that the way they finished the season. But, say that they were, if they had a Group of 5 playoff and Marshall is in that, I guarantee you Brendan Knox doesn't sit out. I guarantee those other big-time players on the defense don't sit out. And, it really brings entertainment, like I said, to the fans. And it brings something to the table because it gives the players something to play for. So, no matter what conference or whatever division you're in, it still gives guys something to play for. And it makes better football because – obviously, if you watched the Marshall bowl game last year, that was kind of brutal to watch. So, and it goes kind of along with what we were saying about Florida and the group of 5 players, not having anything to play for. So I think that we need to really do something as a whole when it comes to college football and fix this problem that has been created with players sitting out and that type of thing. And now I don't blame them for sitting out. If you don't have anything to play for, why risk it? We saw that years ago with Jalen Smith at Notre Dame. He plays in the bowl game against Ohio State and then blows his knee out. And that guy was a top 5 pick, and he ended up getting drafted sometime in the second round. But that was kind of just out of hope that he would overcome his injury and be what he was. But he really lost a lot of money in that sense. So I think that the players have a right to sit out. I don't think they're necessarily in the wrong, but I think it's up to the NCAA and the people in college football to fix this issue and really make it worthwhile for the fans and better the sport. Because I think when it comes to that type of thing, I think that we're not trending in a good direction, and that's why I'm such a supporter of the college football playoff expansion. And if it ever came down to it, I would also be a supporter of a group of 5 playoff for all those same reasons, really.
It's interesting. I've heard that come up before, and to me, it's just like I want the group of 5 to have respect and that they deserve, but at the same time, I feel like that kind of like demolishes the group of 5's respect in the way by having their own separate thing. And I know we've yet to see a group of 5 in the playoffs, and if we had a group of 5 playoffs, I don't know, because we were like, you look at the teams in the past, like UCF, Cincinnati, Boise State years ago, Marshall years ago with Pennington. I honestly think you can make a case that some of these teams could beat some of the teams who've been in the college football playoffs.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
So I don't really know why. I see what you're saying. I'm just not really a fan, because I feel like at that standpoint, you would really never see group of 5 in the college football playoffs. Like, I don't know. Like, I understand especially with Marshall, last year, we've seen teams who, kind of, average, a little above average, some of the star players go out. That Marshall game against Buffalo last year was a meaningless bowl game before, it was even announced who Marshall was going to play. It's a crappy team against Buffalo, and then you have your best players set out. So I'm not really for the group of 5 playoffs. To me, like, I don't know. I feel like if you're going to have the playoffs, if it goes to 8, I feel like there always has to be a group of 5 in the playoffs, because, like, I feel like Cincinnati right now, despite, beating Notre Dame, they're still capable of beating other top teams like Michigan. And it's interesting. I'm not really for the group of 5 playoffs, but you mentioned Brandon Knox setting. I feel like that's going to be kind of a similar situation, when the bowl games are announced with Malik Willis, quarterback of Liberty. This the year, Liberty, heading into this year, they only had 1 or 2 losses last year. They were really, really good. All their games their losses they had were 1 possession. Now I think they have 2 or 3 losses. Obviously, they're not going to get some New Year's Six bowl. So What's the point of him playing? At that point, I don't know. It's like I just don't. I'm not really for the group of 5 playoffs, because I feel like separating them as a whole even gives them less respect, even more in a way. If that makes sense.
Well, I don't necessarily mean like separating them as a whole, like completely. Like, I still think that the group of 5 should have a chance to get in the regular playoff. So like a Cincinnati this year would be the perfect example. So basically, if they qualify, I think that they should be able to play in the big playoff. But say you have say UTSA drops a game towards the end, at that point their season's over. And I don't know a whole lot about UTSA and if they have any NFL draft prospects or anything. But in that scenario, in today's world, those guys would probably end up sitting out their bowl game and whatnot after having such a great season that kind of felt like it was all for nothing. So like at that point, I think UTSA would be one of those teams that would be perfect for a group of 5 playoff, as opposed to like Cincinnati and a team like that. I think if they qualify for in the top, say 8 whenever they do expansion, I think that would be perfect. So let them play in the 8-team playoff, and then any of the higher take the highest ranked group of 5 teams and put them in their own 4 or 8 team playoff and let them, play for something, basically, give everybody a shot. And even the top group of 5 schools like Cincinnati or say SMU or any of those teams, Memphis, that's been pretty good as of recent. So I don't mean to completely take them out from the Power 5, but which obviously we're about to see Cincinnati here in a couple of years move to the Big 12 anyway. So, I think that's something else that we're going to have to watch out for is conference realignment and stuff like that. And that may not be finished. I think that there could still be some other conferences make some moves, and that could have implications for whatever is presented in the future. But it's just a thought, and I know that there's not a lot of people that are on board with that. But there are some circumstances where I feel like this team, like UTSA, had a great season, and they're basically going to have nothing to play for at the end. So
I understand what you're saying. I'm not really for it. To me, I feel like something to be more. I don't know more interesting as it were, but I feel like kind of more deserving without kind of having their own thing is if each group of 5 conference champion plays a pretty good Power 5 in a bowl game. Because you look at some of these teams like Marshall or Memphis, aside from their New Year's Six Bowl a couple years ago, these teams have been good. And some of the, let's say you have a 9-10 win Conference USA team, they're going to play a 6-6 Georgia State and a team in Louisiana like nobody cares about. But when you have your conference champion of each group of 5, and if you have, let's say, I don't know, UTSA play, I don't know, like Wisconsin or just something like that, a big school in a big conference who's not going to qualify for a New Year's Six, I feel like that's much more intriguing. And or even if, like, not necessarily their own playoff, but what if, like, the Sun Belt champion played the Conference USA champion or something like that? But it's not in a playoff format because, we saw years ago Marshall and Northern Illinois, they were both champions in their own conference. Marshall humiliated them, but heading into the game kind of expected to be good because, 2 best teams in conference, there's something to play for that game. If you have a team like UTSA playing a Wisconsin type of team, I feel like, those players who might consider opting out if you play Georgia State, if you're playing Wisconsin, if you have a good game, your draft stock is going to go farther up in that game than it ever has the whole year type of deal. For example, you mentioned UTSA. They have a running back, I think it's Sincere McCormick. He's expected to be a 3rd or 4th round pick.
Yeah.
If he plays and against the Power 5 and does great, especially a team like Wisconsin who has a good defense, his draft stock would help so much. But when you have those meaningless games, in a way, you are kind of better off just opting out. I understand with the Group of 5 playoffs. I'm not really for it. I just want to see Group of 5s play more Power 5s and the bowls. But then then we start talking about the Power 5 players. Like, what would they have to play for?
Exactly. Yeah. And then you worry about them opting out at that point versus, a UTSA or whoever, it's definitely an issue, and there's no correct answer, and right now there's really no solution. I'm just kind of spitting off the top of my head, with possible solutions. And, like you just did, you can pick what I say and, pick out every flaw, and it's not going to be perfect. Now, I just don't know. I don't know that there is a perfect system right now.
Yeah. With every idea, I feel like there's a major flaw, and there's going to be a bad thing no matter what. Because if that Power 5 guy goes out, you're going to lose more money if a Power 5 goes out than a Group of 5 player. And then it's like there's so many possibilities, but there's so many pros and cons, and the cons more than likely will always outweigh the pros in those scenarios. And this college football season is just crazy. And we kind of talked about with Kyle Trask, Pitts, and Tony. Pitts and Tony opting out of the bowl game last season. 1 year ago this time, not being biased, just being honest. As a college football fan, I honestly thought Florida was the best team in the country. I said the whole year the only team who could match with Alabama last year was Florida because their offensive, firepower with, Trask, you have Tony, you have Pitts, Trevon Grimes. despite their defense, being so bad, their offense made up for it. And so then the LSU game happens, and the Marco Wilson, throwing a shoe like he was on I don't know if it's Goldmember or Austin Powers, the one guy who throws a shoe at Austin Powers.
It's Austin Powers, yeah.
And it's like you lose that game, so you're out of the playoffs. You compete great against, Alabama, but you still lose. They had multiple opportunities. I know Matt Jones had a pick in that game, and Florida ran it back, but then they fumbled and went back to Alabama. Like they had opportunities, but they lost. And then Oklahoma was just god awful. I mean, everybody opted out. And it's like 1 year ago, you think they might be the best team in the country. Now, I mean, Dan Mullen is fired, and Florida literally looks like the worst team in the SEC right now. You are a much bigger Florida fan than me. So what are your thoughts on Dan Mullen and Florida Gators parting ways?
Well, I think that it was definitely the right move at this time. I mean, you just mentioned it with the Marco Wilson shoe throw. I think from that moment on, Dan Mullen, for some reason, kind of lost himself along the way, and I don't know if it was that particular moment or just somewhere in between, but it seems like that was the moment that he kind of lost control of things after that loss to LSU. And it was almost like Dan Mullen couldn't get out of his own way. I think the success with Kyle Trask last year almost, I kind of blame it on that, as bad as it seems. Like it was great that Kyle Trask was so great, but Dan Mullen's belief in himself as a quarterback developer, and anytime you watch a Florida game, that's what they put up on the TV screen. He developed Tim Tebow and Dak Prescott and all these guys. And I feel like that, hyped Dan Mullen's ego up so much that he believed that he could fix anybody. And here's the thing. If you look back just a couple years ago when Felipe Franks was the quarterback, had it not been for an ankle injury where Felipe broke his ankle at Kentucky, a game that they were losing, by the way, and Kyle Trask came in and saved the day and, really saved the season in a sense. Had that not happened, we might have never seen Kyle Trask. So it was one of those things where at that time, Dan Mullen was actually kind of saved by Kyle Trask. And then I think, a combination of not having a guy like Trask and then the combination of, his ego kind of getting the best of him, thinking that he can fix Emory Jones and, make him into this NFL prospect like he did with Tebow and Dak, and obviously Dak's having great success in the NFL. I think that was kind of what really hurt Dan Mullen the most was himself. And now obviously the defense at times, especially 2020, was atrocious. They actually statistically got a little bit better this season, but if you have two eyes and a television, you watch Florida this year, you kind of knew that the defense still had major issues. So, getting rid of Todd Grantham a couple weeks ago was kind of just, a Band-Aid to the problem. And we really saw with how they struggled with Stanford, and then the loss to South Carolina first, struggle with Stanford, and then the loss to Missouri this past weekend. That was obviously the icing on the cake. But I think that this was probably a long time coming. But there were just some things along the way that kind of, patched up the boo-boos a little bit and covered up some of Dan Mullen's biggest flaws, which, obviously I said he was his own, biggest obstacle, but his inability to recruit elite talent was also something that they just couldn't overcome, especially this year. I know, like, if you look at the 247 talent composite rankings, Florida had the number 7 most talented roster in America, but they didn't play like that. And so it was kind of a mentality thing mixed with the talent the talent ranking was a little bit inflated because they had taken some 5-star transfers that kind of boosted the numbers a little bit. You take Justin Shorter, who's, he's been good, not great. Or you take Lorenzo Lingard, who was a 5-star running back transfer from Miami that he's only been on special teams. So, the 5 stars that Florida has aren't even, huge contributors at this point. They don't have the first round NFL talent that's a 5-star on the roster. It just doesn't. So, I think that Florida looked around and they kind of looked themselves in the mirror and saw what Alabama had been doing. They saw what Georgia is now doing, being in the same division. I think that they realized that if they don't make a move now and really make an effort, not only with recruiting, but, on the defensive side of the ball and all that stuff, that they're going to continue not only getting passed by Georgia, which obviously has happened, but for the first time in a long time, I was at the Kentucky game and I felt like Kentucky was the more talented team than Florida. I know that's not what the paper says, but I watched the game and I saw how it played out, and I felt like they were better than Florida, just flat out better. And there are some other teams kind of in the SEC on the rise too. You've got Texas A&M, you've got Arkansas, that's not a slouch anymore with Sam Pittman as their head coach. He's got them going in the right direction. So this was the right time to fire Dan Mullen and really try to right the ship, before we hit an iceberg and the whole thing sinks.
It's interesting you bring up the game against Kentucky when Franks gets hurt and, Trask comes in and saves the day. Because if that doesn't happen, Trask doesn't come in and win the game. And Mullen's 4 games against Kentucky, he would have been 1-3. They would not have won that game.
Yeah.
And I think, Florida's won against Kentucky like 20 straight times or something crazy. And the fact, just the inconsistency of Mullen and the potential that he has, but he just can't, do. The potential that Florida had this year, they have potential to be good, just has those games where they lose and they shouldn't. You should be at the top of your potential. You shouldn't always have potential, but you never use the type of deal. Florida was a much better team than LSU last year. Florida was a better team than A&M last year. They lose both those games. When you have coaches who are just so inconsistent and, cannot be consistent and a great coach, and you're going to have those always going to have those games where you lose and you shouldn't. I don't even know how many we've had this year. South Carolina, LSU, Missouri. I mean, there's a couple other ones. And it's like even in their games they've won, they haven't even looked that great. You go back and watch the first games of the year against FAU and South Florida. Look at the scoreboard. It was kind of, you think Florida would kill them. It was actually a little bit closer than what you think because if it wasn't for simple mistakes for both those teams and just poor coaching by those teams, it would have been way closer. I mean, you talk about Kentucky and Florida. Kentucky only beat Florida by just 7 points. You watch that game, it was just completely one-sided from the very beginning. It seemed like despite it being one possession, it was Kentucky the whole game. Florida really had a chance. And, you look at the Alabama game. I mean, they lost by Alabama by just 2 points, which is just crazy. And then, you look at the best team who's on their schedule, which is Georgia. And of all the times, you kind of talked about with Mullen acting like his, maybe his ego, he can fix anybody. Lots of fans towards the beginning of the year thought, Jones might be really good. He was clearly not nearly as good as anybody thought. Then Richardson comes in and plays pretty good in some garbage time. Then all of a sudden, quickly and just shockingly, there's a quarterback competition in Florida. You throw Anthony Richardson under the fire in Georgia, without a doubt the best defense in the country, the best defense we've seen in college football in years. At the time, they were giving up less than 7 points a game. You put your quarterback in there who's never started the game before, and then after that, you haven't played him at all. I know he's been injured some, but to me, that kind of going back and looking at that, it just made no sense. I don't get why a guy who's only played garbage time for the most part is going to come in and your ego comes in. You think, oh, I have this quarterback and he's going to be way better than people think he already is. Oh, he's going to come in there and beat Georgia when you get humiliated. I just don't get it. Something else, talking about Marco Wilson's throwing the shoe, the lack of discipline Dan Mullen has had, just literally, it seems like ever since that game has been an all-time low. It's like Marco Wilson's throwing the shoe. He has no discipline of his team. Obviously, with Pitts and Tony setting out, that's their own decision. But you kind of feel like they were much closer to the coach. Maybe they would have played in that game. You look at this year. It's just like when the whistle blows, you still see Florida, constantly pushing a guy back. When the whistle plays already dead, it's just like players are getting in trouble. Just so many different things, and it's like he has no control of his team. When you have no control of your team, and you're not playing as well as you should be playing, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have your job. And it's obviously, what's happened at Dan Mullen now. And it's crazy because, like I said earlier, just 1 year ago, we're talking about them being the best team in the country, and now they're going to be looking for a new coach. With Mullen, it's 1-7 the last 8 games not in Gainesville, 2-9 the last 11 games against Power Fives. Over half of those losses were against unranked teams. The last 3 games against SEC teams, he's only scored 47 points. Supposedly an offensive guru who take away Trask, Pitts, and Tony. His offensive numbers during his time in Florida aren't even that good. They're pretty much average for a guy who supposedly made Prescott into some great guy in Tebow. Yeah. Maybe it wasn't as much as him. And it's crazy. Something else at this stat here, honestly, I don't know if this is true or not. I saw it and I could not believe it. Supposedly he's 7-45 against ranked opponents. I looked up that a couple of different times, and that's what I was saying, which is just mind-boggling because if you're in the SEC, every other SEC game you're playing, you're probably going to be playing a ranked opponent. So that's pretty much a guaranteed loss at that standpoint. And it's like it was just time. South Carolina, you're picked to win by 20 points. You lose by 20 points to a guy that was his first ever FBS start and a first-year head coach in Beamer. It's just like Missouri, you're picked to win against them. Another game, not in Gainesville, you can't win. I know you beat Samford, but you had to score 70 points. That to me, I was talking to somebody, they fired Grantham. That should never be an excuse. That just shows right there, the inability to coach up to your potential with Mullen, and something else with the lack of discipline. You have players dancing around in the locker room like they just beat Alabama. You beat Samford. It's crazy. It had to happen. I'm glad it happened. I'm a little bit surprised it did, but it's just so crazy because when you look at Florida, there's a couple other big teams who's going to need some coaches as well, like Virginia Tech and USC. So when you look at Florida, who are some coaches to you that come to mind that you would really like to see the Gators possibly hire as their next head coach?
Well, I'm going to start off with this guy, and this name has really gained some steam over the past 2 days, really. But that guy is Billy Napier down at Louisiana. I'd say by now you've probably seen it on Twitter and on Facebook and stuff like that. But Billy Napier seems to be the guy that Florida really wants. And from everything that I've heard and read about him, he kind of checks off a lot of boxes with what Florida is looking for as far as Dan Mullen was a great X's and O's coach, and I'll never say otherwise. I think he is great at that. I think he could scheme up a game plan and even on the fly, and I think he's good at that. But there were some aspects of being a head coach and qualities that he just doesn't possess. And being a CEO, kind of like what Nick Saban is something that Dan Mullen never was. And that's something that Billy Napier, from everything that I've heard and read, something that Billy Napier is. And he kind of has that Saban-like approach to everything he does down there at Louisiana. And that's why they've been, so successful so far. So Billy Napier is a guy that I'm really high on. And, I think that I am pulling for him to be the guy. Now they're going to do, Florida's going to do their due diligence, and they're going to probably interview a couple candidates and, see what's the best fit. But Billy Napier is a guy that I'm kind of leaning towards and thinking that he's going to be the guy. But if not, Lane Kiffin is always a possibility. The only thing with Lane Kiffin to me is I feel like he is basically Dan Mullen with a better personality. He's funny and he's great TV and stuff like that, and he's a great offensive mind. I think him and Dan are two of the best offensive minds in college football. But, with him, I still kind of have concerns about what Florida would look like defensively. You look at Ole Miss, the defense hasn't been great under him. And, you kind of just wonder what the future would look like under Lane Kiffin. For one, how long does he stay? I know that he's never been quite at a place like Florida, so maybe he would end up being there for a while. But his past has shown that he does kind of tend to move around a lot. So if he did well at Florida and an NFL job came calling, there's a chance that he would leave, which, it's hard to blame him in that scenario. But, Lane Kiffin's a possibility, and that's a name that continues to get thrown around. I'm not super high on him as much as I am Billy Napier, but, that's someone that I think that I would have to do a little bit more homework on myself to, kind of convince myself that he's the guy. Another name that kind of comes up sometimes is Mark Stoops up there at Kentucky. I think from a cultural standpoint, I think Mark Stoops would be great. I think that he's brought a great culture to Kentucky, and I think that he approaches things the right way. I'm just not sure that he's a good fit for what Florida wants to do. I think he strikes me as sort of like Muschamp in a way. Kentucky plays great defense, and and on offense they like to run the football, and that kind of reminds me of Will Muschamp quite a bit. He's a solid recruiter, which I think would be an upgrade from Dan Mullen. But I just don't know that if he's exactly what Florida's looking for at the moment. And I'm not even sure if he would leave Kentucky. You go to Florida, the expectations, go way up. You stay at Kentucky and win 8-9 games a year, you're going to stay around for a while. So that's something to think about too. But I'll throw one more name in there, and that's Luke Fickle at Cincinnati. He's obviously a good defensive coach, and was with Ohio State there for a little bit, and I think that he would bring, kind of like Mark Stoops would bring a great culture to Florida, and I think that he is a guy that is kind of a player's coach. I'm not so sure about his recruiting abilities yet. Being at Cincinnati, you just don't recruit the 5 stars, like you probably would try to do at Florida. So, that's kind of a little bit of a question mark for me. And, it's also a question mark as far as is his loyalty kind of within the Midwest, because that's kind of where he's been throughout his career. So, if a job opportunity, say Ryan Day leaves for the NFL at some point from Ohio State, would he then leave Florida to go to Ohio State? That's always a possibility too. Or say if Notre Dame came open, would Notre Dame pursue him? So that's the biggest thing with Luke Fickle. But I think he would be an upgrade, as I think would any of the other guys that that I named from what Dan Mullen's been able to do. But whoever it is, the biggest thing is, first and foremost, you've got to start recruiting. Dan Mullen, he made the comment a few weeks ago about not recruiting in the season, and that kind of, it may have been taken a little bit out of context, but, it kind of turned some people off from him just with that comment, and it, made some people mad. But I think you get a guy in there that runs it like a business and is loyal, but not too loyal to where, he's going to keep his friends around, much like Dan Mullen did with John Hevesy, the offensive line coach, and Todd Grantham, the defensive coordinator. I think that he's going to have to approach it like a business, and it's show up and show out, or you can leave. That's got to be the motto. So, and real quick, Billy Napier, he's kind of already become famous with Florida fans with this little 3-second clip on Twitter, but he talks about scared money don't make money, and so that's kind of the saying right now. In Gator Nation is scared money don't make money. So they're kind of all in with Billy Napier right now, thinking that he's the guy that's going to come in and be able to sell the program and kind of get Florida back on track. So those are just a couple of guys that Florida's looking at. But Billy Napier, once again, I think he is the leader at this point in the clubhouse.
And it's crazy to me because, with all these head coaching vacancies and at top schools like USC, Virginia Tech, Florida, maybe some other ones, and I've read stuff. Florida picked a bad time to fire Mullen. In my opinion, I think Florida is the best top spot you could possibly go to. I'd rather go to Florida than USC. USC, it seems like you have higher expectations at times in, Florida. And, you talked about Billy Napier. To me, that is the clear number one choice. And, I'm a big fan of Group of Five schools. I've been talking about it a lot throughout the episode. But when you look at these small schools, for example, like Louisiana is 38-12 with as Billy Napier as their head coach. He's had 3 straight 10-win seasons, and I've heard lots of stuff, with the Nick Saban coaching tree. Lots of people came from Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, the job he's done in Georgia. He came from Saban. Billy Napier has came from Clemson with Dabo Swinney and Saban from Alabama. So you have 2 great coaches that you've already had, experience with. You can learn a lot from them. But something else, like he keeps a daily track of what he does constantly, like Nick Saban. I mean, I feel like he would be terrific at Florida. He's more of an offensive-minded coach. You look at his recruiting. You mentioned that. It's a big part, whoever's going to be the next head coach. Louisiana's had the best recruiting class in the Sun Belt the last 3 years. And you might say, well, the Sun Belt really don't have anybody. That's really not true, because Appalachian State's been a powerhouse, for years, and to have a better recruiting class for them for 3 straight years, that's very, very, very impressive. So I feel like Napier, to me, that's clearly number one. I feel like Lou Fickle, though, if he's willing to take it, I feel like he's right up there with Napier, though. The job he's done at Cincinnati, I mean, you can't really get much better than that. I feel like he would be really good with Florida. And I don't know. It's interesting. There was supposedly a rumor a week or so ago. I don't know if it's actually true or not. Lincoln Riley turned down a job at LSU. I feel like he'd be more inclined to take a job at Florida than LSU. I feel like Lincoln Riley, though, is kind of in that Dan Mullen situation where he doesn't live up to the full potential that he has type of deal. Because, we've seen in Oklahoma, they have potential of going undefeated and winning a college football championship. I mean, you said earlier you had them winning the whole thing this year, but they're not living up to their expectation, just like how Mullen was this year and even last year, despite playing a New Year's Six Bowl. So I wouldn't be against him. Obviously, you would rather have him than Dan Mullen. But I don't know. You mentioned Mark Stoops. It's interesting. I've heard some people say Bob Stoops, which I don't get that. I definitely rather have Mark.
Yeah, Bob Stoops. That's another name that it does come up a lot. I just don't think that you hire a 61-year-old that has been out of the game for a couple of years and expect him to come in and recruit against Nick Saban and Kirby Smart. I just don't think you do that. I hear that all the time, and I've seen a lot of Florida fans say that they want Bob Stoops, and I just kind of laugh because I just don't think that is the way to go in any way.
And let's say, Bob Stoops, that's basically hiring at Florida is basically the equivalent of Mac Brown going to North Carolina. Like, you're going to be in that 8-9 win seasons, but more than likely with the age of Stoops is in, there's a chance we could be in this exact situation 4 or 5 years from now. And, you don't know how he's going to come out with, not coaching for years. So I'd much rather have Mark Stoops and Bob Stoops. Mark Stoops is
for sure,
at Kentucky. And, we talked about Florida had like a 20-game winning streak against Kentucky. Just something, something really, really close happens, with Trask coming back. All of a sudden, they're 1-3. Kentucky is no slouch what they used to be in years past. They are much better. And, they are up to where Florida's ranks have been the past couple of years, it seems like. Yeah. And I feel like somebody else, Mario Cristobal at Oregon.
Yeah, I was going to bring him up too.
I like him quite a bit. I feel like, he would do a great job. I feel like he would be better than Mullen. I feel like, honestly, really anybody would be better than Dan Mullen at this point. And, it's one of those things, if you hire an offensive-minded guy, if you have Richardson, it could be potentially success from the start, and they could be great.
Yeah.
I know lots of people like Lane Kiffin. I do not want him at all. I cannot stand Kiffin. He has an ego. He's just arrogant. I feel like, I was talking to somebody the other day. It's like, as crazy as it sounds, if Lane Kiffin went to Florida and had the success that he's had at Ole Miss the first couple of years, he would be looking for a higher job. Every single thing with Kiffin is just a part-time thing. He went to FAU for like 3 years, left as soon as he could, went to Ole Miss. If he goes to Florida, he'll be out within 3 years looking for a higher job.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel like I don't feel like Lane Kiffin is actually committed to a program more or less a top job and a top paycheck. I think he would be great with Richardson. I just don't want Kiffin as the coach as Florida, kind of like you mentioned with Mullen. He has potential to be good, but his ego might get in the way a little bit. He's kind of arrogant, might think he's better than he actually is.
Right.
Like I said, I feel like Napier is definitely the top choice. I would be fine with Fickle. I'd be fine with Riley, Cristobal, even Mark Stoops. I just definitely, if I had to pick one coach I don't want, it would definitely be Lane Kiffin. I just do not want to see him in Gainesville.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Cristobal. Actually, he kind of slipped my mind a little bit. But Billy Napier and Mario Cristobal are the two probably at the top of my list. And I know that, Oregon has had a little bit of trouble getting up for the big games, especially they just got their brains beat in by Utah the other night. But, they did beat Ohio State, so that's encouraging. But he has been, pretty good at Oregon so far. But I tell you what, if you put him at a place like Florida in the SEC and with his Florida ties, he was on Nick Saban's staff with Billy Napier a few years back, if you remember. And, I mean, they were just a recruiting powerhouse with that staff. And Mario Cristobal was a big player, a big reason for that. And so I think you put him back in the state of Florida with his ties to South Florida and everything like that. And I think that he instantly makes the roster more talented through recruiting, probably more so than any other candidate there is. Now that's not to say that Billy Napier can't recruit because, like I said, Billy Napier was on that staff too, and he can recruit. I mean, he was responsible for recruiting Jerry Jeudy and Calvin Ridley and Cam Robinson, and even way back at his days at Clemson, he was the primary recruiter for Taj Boyd. So he's been there and done that, and he has, brought in some big time players before. So, sitting in these 5 stars living rooms is nothing new to Billy Napier, and it's nothing new to Mario Cristobal. So to me, you get one of those two guys, and just from a talent perspective, you give yourself a shot when you put yourself on the field with Alabama and Georgia and, those blue bloods of college football.
Like I said, to me, I feel like Napier is a top choice with the recruiting and the ties and coming from the Saban tree and everything like that. I feel like he would be the best fit. I'm not trying to argue with myself, but the one downfall I have of Billy Napier, despite him doing a great job at Louisiana, he's the Sun Belt. It's a better conference than people think, but there is a significant gap between the Sun Belt and the SEC. The fact that he's not had a head coaching job at a Power 5, and for instance, I mean, look at McElwain. He came from Colorado State. Honestly, he didn't do that great of a job at Colorado State. Comes in, absolutely sucks. Purposely does not play Will Grier because he was not his recruit. Was just really bad from the get-go. I feel like Napier is much, much, much different than McElwain. But I feel like in that scenario, the fact that, doesn't have that Power 5 experience is kind of the main downfall that I'm a little bit concerned. But overall, despite that, I would still say Napier is clearly the top choice for the Gators.
Yeah, well, and I will say this, about with what you're saying. He does lack the head coaching experience from a big conference perspective. He's only in the Sun Belt. He hasn't been in a Power 5 conference before, but neither had Kirby Smart. Kirby Smart had never even been a head coach. And so basically, as long as you're a dog on the trail, you can figure it out from there. So, you've got to be willing, not only willing, but you have to want to recruit. And I think that from everything I've heard, I think Billy Napier does. And, if he wants to recruit and runs his program like they say he does and runs it like Nick Saban, then, that's basically the, Kirby Smart 2.0, it sounds like. So, I've been super harsh on Kirby Smart in the past for his, from what I think of his coaching abilities or lack of. But it really doesn't matter if you can't coach if you're putting that type of talent on the field like he has. So and I'm not saying Kirby's a bad coach. I think that he's good. He's probably not like X's and O's and that type of thing. Not great, but he's good and wants to bring the best players that he can to his program. And I think that that's really all you need from your CEO / head coach. And I think that that's what Billy Napier can be. And if he is that, then you pretty much hire Urban Meyer 2.0. Because Urban Meyer came from the Group of Five also at Utah when they were in the Mountain West. So I think that there is a little bit of a risk, but when you look at the personalities, I don't think his personality is very like Mullenish. I don't think it's McElwainish. I think he kind of feels more like Urban Meyer than any of those other guys, and that kind of gives me a sense of comfort. So if he comes in, if Florida does hire him and he comes in and it just doesn't work out, then hey, I'll come back on here and say I was dead wrong. But I think from everything that I've read and heard that Billy Napier seems to be the real deal.
And you mentioned kind of like the CEO, like a Kirby Smart or Nick Saban, reading some articles. That's kind of what Billy Napier has waited for. He's waited opportunities to kind of have that CEO type of role.
Yeah.
There were supposedly rumors about South Carolina last year, Auburn, a couple other teams, Mississippi State. I think they were one of the teams interested in him, but he wants to have full control, kind of like a Saban. The him not having a Power 5 head coaching job, that's the only thing I have.
Right, yeah.
But everything else, there is so many more pros than there are cons. Honestly, I feel like that's the only con. There are so many pros coming from Sweeney, coming from Saban. Just the way he approaches a game, the recruiting aspect, I feel like that could be major because that's totally been lacking in Florida during Dan Mullen's tenure at the Gators. But it's interesting because it's just crazy. 1 year ago, you did not think this was going to be in the situation the Gators are currently in. Cannot wait to see who they hire as their head coach. Any other topics or anything like that you kind of have before we close it out?
Just real quick, just to kind of add on to what we were just talking about. Dan Mullen wasn't known obviously as a great recruiter, but what he did lack in recruiting, he was a pretty good developer, and there's really no denying that. Obviously, he didn't develop enough, but I think that he left some good talent there at Florida. So I think that whoever the next coach is getting a capable roster. Obviously they're not up to the standard of Georgia or Alabama or anyone like that yet, but I think that there are some good pieces there. And with the way of the transfer portal nowadays, who knows what a guy like Billy Napier could do right away if he came in, because look, guys don't have to sit out anymore. They can come right in and play. So that's something to just kind of watch out for. But I think that whoever it is, when you come in, the first thing you do is get Anthony Richardson on the phone and say, "You're my quarterback, and we're going to do this thing together." And then Florida has a nice stable of backs that Dan Mullen did stockpile some good talent in that running back room. So you've got Anthony Richardson, some good running backs. I think you need to maybe shore up the wide receiver room a little bit more. But you do that, and offensively you're looking pretty good just to begin with. Now, obviously, the biggest thing is going to be fixing the defense. But I think that everything, like I said, that I've heard about Billy Napier, he's going to bring in the best people that he can, and that he trusts to do so. And if he gets this defense on the right track, I'm telling you, this offense already has some good pieces in place. They could be pretty good next year. I'm not ready to say that they're going to be a playoff team next year, but they could easily, be a 8-9, who knows, maybe even 10-win team next season. Dan Mullen took over worse than what he's leaving is basically what I'm getting at. So, and he won 10 games in his first year. So, I think that this new coach has some resources. I think it's up to him to kind of utilize them and put the best product that he can on the field.
Yeah, you talk about utilize talent. You mentioned running backs. I know Napier during his time at Louisiana, he loves to run the ball. He's had Trey Regis, he's had Elijah Mitchell, 49ers now. They had a committee of 3 running backs, and like all 3 of them had over like 800 rushing yards or something crazy. So I mean, if you get a guy like Napier, Florida already has good running backs, like you mentioned. I would not surprise me at all, depending who the coach is, especially if it's Billy Napier. If we see Florida possibly ranks in the top 25 next year, maybe 3rd, maybe 4th in the SEC total next year. Cannot wait to see who they hire as their head coach. It's going to be very, very, very interesting. So that kind of really about does it for this episode. So TJ, can you kind of tell some of the listeners who can follow you on social media and a little bit about your podcast you have?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at TJ Shoemaker 2423, and my podcast is the Section 111 podcast. It's kind of more of a college football based podcast. So if you'd like to talk or like to listen to college football, come on over and give it a listen and see if it's something that's for you. Tomorrow I've actually got a pretty good episode cooked up. I've got Doug Lemarice from the Buckeye Talk podcast, which is a very well-known Ohio State podcast. He's going to be joining myself and my brother Tyler Shoemaker, who plays a big role in my podcast too. And we kind of, we talk a little bit of betting, sports betting, and betting lines for college football. And we go deep into college football and talk different teams. And he has, long story short, he has a good computer model that he uses to kind of project games and handicaps them in a sense, and does give out some bets and stuff like that. But, it also is good because it gives you a real idea of, how good a team is. And, more times than not, he's pretty much right on par with what Vegas thinks. And, Vegas rarely loses. So, just come on over to the Section 111 podcast and give it a listen.
I definitely put the links in the description below. I've been able to hear a couple of your episodes. It's really, really cool. You should definitely check that out. That about does it for this episode. Make sure to follow me at Stu Hines Show on Twitter and Sports Stu Hines Show on Instagram. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We really, really appreciate it. See you all next time on Sports Stu Hines Show.